May 14th, 1948. Independence Day in Israel.
This is a great day. This is your dream come true.
A day of celebration.
Everybody was cheering in the streets.
Amid the drumbeats of war.
What they don't know, there's going to be a big prize.
The hope continues on today's 700 Club.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this edition of the 700 Club. We have today a man who cheated death. He was at death's door, thought he was going to die. Everybody, I'm sure, was praying, but thought he was going to die. A miraculous recovery. It's all written down in a book, and we'll tell you more about it. Well, our president took a strong stand in Kenya, going back to his daddy's home. Was he standing against radical Islam? No, he was standing before those Kenyans in favor of gay rights. But then the president was rebuked by the president of Kenya himself.
Well, the president's action drew a great deal of attention after Christian leaders and some politicians in the country warned him not to bring up the subject. Dale Hurd has the story.
Today, President Obama held talks with Ethiopia's leaders on counterterrorism, human rights, and regional security. He's the first sitting American president to visit the East African nation. Obama wrapped up a two-day trip to Kenya Sunday, urging the homeland of his father to root out corruption, treat women and minorities as equals, and to protect the rights of homosexuals.
I've been consistent all across Africa on this. I believe in the principle of treating people equally under the law, and that they are deserving of equal protection under the law, and that the state should not discriminate against people based on their sexual orientation.
But in a tense exchange, Kenya's president rejected Obama's message on gay rights, saying it was one value that Christian Kenya does not share with the United States.
The fact of the matter is that Kenya and the United States, we share so many values. But there are some things that we must admit we don't share. Our culture, our societies don't accept. This is why I repeatedly say that for Kenyans today, the issue of gay rights is really a non-issue.
In Kenya, homosexual relations carries a punishment of imprisonment. In this overwhelmingly Christian nation, many residents shrugged off the U.S. president's lecture on gay rights.
Of course, the way President Obama talked about gayism and what have you, lesbianism or transgender, whatever, according to him, we took him as an American. He was answering like an American. He was for, but according to our African culture, the Christian beliefs, we say no.
Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Well, maybe Africa will be the fountainhead of a new wave of Christian belief because we applaud their strong stand about cultural righteousness. Well, here at home, Hillary Clinton is laying out her ideas of what she would do as president, including taking on global warming. And she has a new tax plan. John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. Here's John.
That's right, Pat. The former Secretary of State unveiled her plan Sunday to fight climate change. It includes revamping the tax code to promote renewable energy and possibly imposing changes on the coal industry. Clinton says people just aren't paying attention if they don't think climate change is real. But polls repeatedly have shown climate change ranks at the bottom of voters' concerns. And Friday, Clinton talked about her new plan for taxes on capital gains, which includes business investments. She wants higher rates to encourage longer-term investments, but conservatives quickly criticized her ideas, saying it would raise taxes on investments to the highest rates in decades at a time when the U.S. is experiencing the weakest economic recovery since World War II. Well, a group called the Satanic Temple unveiled a bronze statue in Detroit this weekend, paying tribute to Satan. The event attracted so much publicity that out-of-towners drove in to see it, and Detroit police had to take up positions to keep the calm.
We support anyone's First Amendment right.
It just seemed like it would be a historic event.
The goat-headed figure stands 9 feet tall. The Satanic Temple had plans for a private event, but the restaurant owner canceled its reservations after learning what was planned. Originally, it was meant for the state capitol in Oklahoma City until the state Supreme Court banned a monument of the Ten Commandments. The Satanic Temple says it supports separation of church and state. It now wants to place the figure outside the Arkansas State House, where a Ten Commandments monument is planned. Pat?
You know, aren't you appalled? First of all, we say that being a homosexual is a constitutional right. Before that, we said that slaughtering unborn babies was a constitutional right. And now we want to unveil a statue of Satan in the midst of that economically plagued city. Can you believe that? Where are we heading? Isn't this what is going to bring the judgment of God upon us? You say, well, could we possibly be serving idols? Could we be sacrificing our babies to some heathen god? Is there something that we're going to be having ritual sacrifice on the state house lawn of some state? Are we going to be allowing this to happen? And while we're doing it, we'll be having polygamy and polyamory and all the other things that go along with a corrupt culture. Is that the way we're heading? Well, it looks like it is. But I'm glad to report there is a bright spot, the Texas Supreme Court. Here's John.
That's right, Pat. The Texas State Supreme Court has told the city of Houston to either repeal its controversial gay rights ordinance or put it on the ballot so that Houstonians can vote on it in November. The city council passed the measure last year at the urging of Houston's mayor, who is a lesbian. Pastors and other opponents gathered some 18,000 signatures needed to put the ordinance on the ballot. The city council said many of the signatures were invalid, and when the pastors sued, the mayor tried to subpoena their sermons. Texas Governor Greg Abbott praised the ruling, saying freedom of expression can only exist once government removes itself from stifling free speech, repressing religious liberty, and interfering with the lives of citizens. An autopsy will be conducted on Bobby Christina Brown, the daughter of the late singer Whitney Houston. Brown was 22. She was found unresponsive in the bathtub of her home in Atlanta in January and has been in a nursing home for months. She was the only child of Houston and R&B singer Bobby Brown. A statement from the family says she is, quote, finally at peace in the arms of God. Houston left her entire estate to Bobby Christina. It was worth an estimated $100 million. Well, the latest research in Alzheimer's has a clear theme. Change your lifestyle so you can protect your brain. Regardless of possible progress on new experimental drugs, there are some basic everyday steps people can take to keep their brains healthy as they get older. They include getting better sleep, exercising your brain through activities like crossword puzzles or music lessons, staying active because what's good for the heart is good for the brain, keeping up your mental health, avoiding problems like loneliness and stress, and eating healthy with a diet high in fruits and vegetables and lower in fat and sugar. Pat, that's good for your arteries. What's good for your arteries is also good for your brains and keeps blood flowing to your brain.
Phosphatidylserine complex.
Say that fast 3 times. we had phone calls the last time you mentioned that, saying, what was that?
What was that? All right, quick. Do you do all those things, sweetie?
Well, I don't do that thing you just mentioned, but I do the crossword puzzle every day, and I...
Fruits and nuts?
Fruits and nuts. Yeah, I probably should eliminate some other things.
Berries every day. I eat nuts every day. I put yogurt on every day, and it makes a delightful breakfast.
It's awesome. And you
with
do
some
that.
bran stuff. Okay.
Say that again. What is it?
Phosphatidylserine. That's good for your brain. Acetyl-L-carnitine is to...
Writing them down as we speak.
Acetyl-L-carnitine will help you lose weight as well as...
Great.
Yeah.
You told me that before.
Yeah, so it keeps your brain healthy and keeps your body thin.
What's not to like, right?
All right. What do we got next?
Well, up next, we have the first person with the Ebola virus ever treated in the United States. Dr. Ken Bradley talks about his heroic battle to save others from the epidemic and his personal nightmare as the victim of the deadly disease. He's going to join us along with his wife, Amber, when we come back.
I'm good. When a person gets Ebola, he or she dies. The mortality rate is up to over 90%, maybe even closer to 100. It's very rare to find anybody that survived it. And we have with us now a man who wrote a book, along with his lovely wife, Amber, Kent and Amber Brantley. It's a fascinating story and very well written, and I commend it to you. It's called Called for Life. Well, last year, as you know, there was the worst Ebola outbreak in history. It killed about 11,000 people in West Africa. One American missionary doctor was right in the middle of it, trying to save lives before the deadly virus put his own life in danger. Take a look at this.
For 6 weeks last summer, Dr. Kent Brantley worked nonstop, treating dozens of Ebola patients at a hospital in Liberia. Ebola is highly contagious and deadly, claiming up to 90% of its victims. Despite taking extreme precautions, Brantley started feeling sick, and 3 days later heard the devastating news that he too had contracted the deadly virus. Christians around the world began praying for Brantley's recovery. His mission organization, SIM, arranged to have him evacuated to Emory Hospital in Atlanta, making Kent Brantley the first person infected with Ebola to be brought to the United States for treatment. Miraculously, he survived and was released from isolation 3 weeks later. He and his wife, Amber, have written about their experience in a new book, Called for Life: How Loving Our Neighbor Led Us into the Heart of the Ebola Epidemic.
Well, Dr. Kent Brantley and his wife Amber are joining us now. And Kent, you know, I was just fascinated by this book. At what point did you think you were dying? Did you ever give up and you said, I'm going to die, I'm ready to meet the Lord?
There was a night, Thursday, July 31st, when I looked at the nurse standing next to my bed and I said, I don't know how you're going to breathe for me when I quit breathing. Because I really thought that I might die that night of respiratory failure. I was having such a hard time breathing. Mm-hmm. I don't think I ever gave up, but I had a tremendous peace from the Lord that in spite of the anxiety that I was feeling, the fear that I was facing, I just wanted to be faithful. Mm-hmm. I desperately wanted to be faithful.
You know, you had diarrhea 10, 12, 15 times a day. You're a doctor and you knew that bloody flux coming out of you. You knew what it meant. And it meant your organs were collapsing, didn't it?
It did. And it was even more than that.
More than that?
They said in my first day at Emory, they said in the first 24 hours, I think I went through 28 bedpans.
20? Well, how did you survive? You'd be so weak. I don't understand how you were even able to hold your head up.
A lot of good supportive care from the people taking care of me in Liberia and at Emory.
Well, over in Liberia, apparently there was this guy who had this stuff, and he had developed an immunity, and so you had live transfusions from this African?
That's right. Our first survivor, the only survivor that I treated in our first 2 months of the outbreak, was a 14-year-old boy who kept in touch with me after he recovered. He would call me about once or twice a week and just check on me and let me know how his family was doing. And after I got sick with Ebola, he called me one day and I told him, I'm sick with that Ebola virus. And then I discussed with his guardian the idea of a blood transfusion. My doctors were interested in that possibility. And that young boy and his family wanted to do anything they could to help, and he came to the hospital and donated a unit of blood for me.
Well, it was amazing. You write in here about this outfit in Kentucky that has developed monoclonal antibody treatment based on tobacco. We found a good use for tobacco finally.
It is a phenomenal medication, a phenomenal process to produce this medication. My story with ZMapp is one anecdote, and while I think it's a very convincing anecdote, scientifically speaking, it takes much more data than one patient to prove whether something works or not. So that drug's actually in trial right now in West Africa.
Well, if they hadn't had it, you may have died. We don't know. All right, Amber, you have your husband, you love him, you're together, and you're serving the Lord in Liberia, and all of a sudden, did you think he was going to die?
I always clung to hope that he wouldn't, but I didn't eliminate it as a possibility. There were some moments, like the Thursday that he mentioned, that I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure.
When you were praying, I mean, could you get hold of the Lord, or did you just feel hopeless?
I swayed in and out of that. I had so much support from our family and dear friends who surrounded me and cared for me and my children and prayed for me and sent me messages and sent me scripture that I could pray, because I couldn't even think enough to come up with that on my own. But I prayed the hymns that I grew up with, and I prayed the Psalms, and I was just sustained by our support there.
There were millions of people praying for it. This thing was a worldwide phenomenon, because you were, I mean, the whole thing. But they put you in quarantine too.
In a way. I kind of hid out away from the media, but I wasn't forced to quarantine myself medically. I had to measure my temperature several times a day, but I wasn't forced to quarantine. But it did protect me from the media and the chaos that was happening around us.
Ken, you know, it was so primitive what you're saying. You know, I've worked in Liberia extensively, and it was worse than what you said. I mean, I didn't know it was as bad as what you said. You didn't have anything but Tylenol. I mean, I can't believe it. How did you survive this thing?
I thank God that I'm here today.
Yes.
He used a lot of incredible people to take care of me from the moment I felt sick until my recovery.
Well, you had to get out of Liberia. You probably would have died under that primitive condition. And what did you have to do in order to enable yourself? You had to have somebody get you an airplane. I think Franklin Graham and Samaritan's Purse.
Samaritan's Purse did everything within their abilities to take care of me. And they had contacts in the State Department and with Phoenix Air and the Liberian government, and all of these different players came together. It took so many different people to make that evacuation happen, and they were able to fly an airplane to Liberia, put me on it, and return to Atlanta.
They didn't tell anybody you were coming. Nobody wants Ebola in their city. I mean, the people of Atlanta didn't exactly send out a brass band to welcome you.
I'm incredibly thankful to the CDC and the people at Emory University Hospital who put themselves out there and said, we're willing to take care of the first Ebola patient in America.
What was the plane like? You were in a G3 and you were flying across the ocean. How was it configured, that plane you were in?
I was in a reclining bed, like a hospital cot, inside this plastic pod, that aeromedical biocontainment system. And I had a bucket for a toilet, and I had bottles of water and hand sanitizer and a small handheld radio, like a walkie-talkie, to be able to talk to the medical crew. And they would come in periodically and check on me in their full protective equipment. It was a very long ride.
It must have been horrible. Well, you were in a pod, though. Well, when you got off, did they have you in some kind of a pod to get you off the plane?
They put one of those protective suits on me, and I walked off of the plane with the help of a paramedic. And they put me in the ambulance, and that was the same paramedic who helped me walk into the hospital.
I don't see how you walked.
By the grace of God.
Really?
After that ZMAP, I had about a 48 or 60-hour window of improved strength. And it was during that window of time that the evacuation occurred. And it was an answer to prayer. It was maybe the effect of the medication, rehydration, and the grace of God. But Dr. Robertson, I want to be sure that one thing we talk about today is that this outbreak is not over. That people in West Africa are still suffering from Ebola. Just last week, there were 26 new cases diagnosed in Sierra Leone and Guinea. And Liberia, which was declared Ebola-free in May, had a resurgence of cases at the end of June.
They don't know anything about sanitation. Is that it? Or?
There are a lot of factors that are propagating this outbreak, and it's getting better. But one of the problems they've had is that these new cases that are popping up, they don't even know where they're getting it from. They're not the contacts that have been traced. That's improving, and in Sierra Leone that was really improved, or in Conakry that was really improved this last week. But there's a lot of work, and we need to be praying for our neighbors in West Africa.
I was working with our organization in Zaire, and of course Ebola, as you know, was named after the Ebola River in Zaire, and they had a big outbreak in Kikwik, and we were sending supplies, and but they didn't know, but it was coming, as I understand, out of bats. You know, in case, and they still don't know. But what does it take? One drop of blood? I mean, what, to spread that stuff? It's very contagious, isn't it?
It just takes a little bit of contact with a person who's sick with it.
Well, how'd you get it? I mean, you had some little girl you wanted to be nice to?
I think I will never know for sure. I'll never know for sure. I think I probably contracted it from one of the patients I was taking care of in the emergency room outside of the Ebola treatment unit, or maybe from her family member who was helping tend to her as I tried to counsel that family member and gain her trust that we were trying to do the best thing for her mother. And it was probably somewhere in that interaction.
Well, did you wear the hazmat suit all the time, or you had that protective gear off when you were dealing with her?
I was not wearing that gear in the emergency room. It was not practical or feasible or good or safe to do that you couldn't do it all the time. In the treatment unit, we wore that protective gear. Our protocols, our procedures, our equipment were all safe and appropriate. But in the emergency department, it's where you have the undifferentiated patient coming in. You don't know, do they have malaria or is this Ebola?
When I was over there, they had something they used to call diarrhea rouge, which was really more deadly almost than the Ebola. I mean, they just had constant diarrhea. Was that one of the symptoms you had?
That's a really important point, is that this Ebola outbreak has been terrible, and there have been over 11,284 people who have died in this outbreak. But there are a lot of problems in West Africa and in the African continent that are a lot of health problems that kill more people every year than Ebola that we need to be paying attention to. We need to be showing love and compassion to our neighbors in West Africa, not only for Ebola, but for all of the other factors, other problems. Malaria kills hundreds of thousands of people every year, and we need to be doing something about it.
You know, I'm a fan of DDT. When they banned DDT, malaria jumped to, you know, what is it, 500 or 600 million? I mean, it's horrible in the number of people. Let me ask you this. Is there a chance that this Ebola would break out on an airplane or something, come to the United States and really start a major epidemic, or has that been...
I think what we saw at the peak of this epidemic with the cases that were diagnosed in this country is that our healthcare system is equipped in a totally different way than the health systems in West Africa for dealing with a problem like Ebola. And even though we had some cases diagnosed here, we were able to prevent a large outbreak. And I think we need to set that fear of the zombie apocalypse in America aside, and we need to be worried about putting an end to this outbreak in West Africa.
You want to go back to Liberia, Amber?
I'd love to someday.
Would you really?
We got to go back in June this summer for a visit, and it was so brief, but so necessary for our family to get to go back and see our friends and greet and thank all the people who took care of Kent. And it was a wonderful visit, and our hearts are there, and we'll always be forever changed by our time in Liberia.
Well, I tell you, it's an amazing story. Ladies and gentlemen, this book is called Call for Life. You want to read it. It's very well done, and it's Amber talking and Kent talking and Amber talking and Kent talking. So you go back and forth to their point of view. But thank God for you and your testimony and your service. ELWA used to be a Christian radio station. You were working with them, or who were you? Yeah.
In fact, when we went back in June, I got to be interviewed on that radio station.
It's still there.
It's still there.
Okay. Well, that's all right. Well, God bless you both. And ladies and gentlemen, it's called Call for Life, a survivor of the dread Ebola outbreak in West Africa. So, Terry, what do you got?
Well, coming up next, something very special, The Hope. We're going to talk about Israel's Independence Day.
He was cheering in the streets. It was a big thing, dancing in the streets and all this. And he was standing in the back there. He says, what the people are dancing here, what they don't know is tomorrow we've got a war.
Watch how Israel experienced the taste of birth and the fear of death all at the same time. We'll be back after this. For Jewish leaders in 1948, the decision to declare statehood wasn't an easy one because they knew that independence also meant war.
with 5 different armies surrounding Palestine. The Jewish National Council had just 24 hours to prepare for a day that had been 2,000 years in the making. Council members placed a telephone call to Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann, who was in New York, rounding up United Nations support for the new state. When he heard they had voted for statehood, he exclaimed in Yiddish, "What are they waiting for, the idiots?" That same day, Golda Meir was ordered to fly to Jerusalem to meet with outgoing British leaders. She wanted to stay in Tel Aviv and attend the proclamation, but Ben-Gurion was adamant. So Golda boarded a small Piper Cub. But as her plane flew over the Judean hills, the engine malfunctioned, and the pilot was forced to turn back to Tel Aviv. So Golda got her wish, a front row seat at the proclamation ceremony. 350 invitations were sent out to Jewish leaders, rabbis, and members of the Haganah. Dark festive attire was requested, and the invitation stipulated that the time and place of the ceremony was to be kept secret. The council decided to hold the ceremony in the Tel Aviv Art Museum. It was a modest building, small enough to be easily guarded, and partly below ground level in case of an air raid. The council met for the last time to go over the wording of the declaration, which had been written by a group of lawyers. Religious members refused to sign the document unless it contained a mention of God, while others refused to sign anything that did mention God. David Ben-Gurion came up with a compromise. To the final line of the declaration, he added, "with trust in the Rock of Israel," a phrase that satisfied both sides. The night before the ceremony, Ben-Gurion still wasn't happy with the language of the proclamation. So that evening in his home, he rewrote the entire speech. While less than 2 miles away, the Tel Aviv Art Museum was being prepared for the ceremony. 2 carpenters worked through the night to build a small stage. The entire budget for the event was just $200. So organizers borrowed hundreds of chairs from nearby cafes, and local stores lent them microphones and carpets. A borrowed portrait of Theodor Herzl was placed at the front of the room, and 2 blue and white flags were hung on either side of his portrait. The flags bore the same design that had been introduced at Herzl's first Zionist Congress 50 years earlier. At Ben-Gurion's request, the paintings in the main hall were replaced with the work of Jewish artists like Marc Chagall and Samuel Hirschenberg. The stage was set. On the afternoon of May 14th, several council members met to approve the final draft of the declaration. The text was approved unanimously, but just hours before it would be read, the new state still didn't have a name. Historical names like Zion and Judea were proposed and rejected. It was Ben-Gurion who decided that the name would be simply Medinat Israel, the State of Israel. 1 hour before the ceremony, council members rushed home to change their clothes, while a secretary quickly typed out the declaration. With just minutes to spare, Zev Sharef, the man carrying the final copy, couldn't get a taxi, so he hitched a ride to the museum. His car got pulled over for speeding, and a policeman started to write him a ticket. Sharef argued that the ticket wouldn't be legal because the British had left, and there was no longer any government to enforce it. Plus, he added, "If you keep us any longer, there won't be a new government because I'm the one holding the Declaration of Independence." The policeman waved them on, and just 1 minute before the ceremony, Sharef handed Ben-Gurion his speech. Despite the instructions for secrecy, The news had leaked out, and a large crowd gathered outside the museum. Jewish leaders were now racing the sunset to finish the ceremony before the Sabbath began at 5 o'clock. At 4 p.m., David Ben-Gurion called the meeting to order. The crowd rose and sang Hatikvah. Then Ben-Gurion read the declaration aloud.
The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. Thus we hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel to be known as the State of Israel. We appeal to the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally around the Jews of Eretz Israel and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel. Placing our trust in the Rock of Israel, we affix our signatures to the proclamation on the soil of the homeland, in the city of Tel Aviv, on this Shabbat Eve, the 14th of May, 1948.
After each member of the new government had signed the proclamation, the orchestra played Hatikvah once again. As the music died down, Ben-Gurion declared, "The state of Israel is established. This meeting is adjourned." It had taken just 32 minutes to bring independence to a people who had been without a country for 2,000 years. Outside the museum, hundreds of people danced while others wept. That night, Ben-Gurion wrote a simple entry in his diary.
Throughout the country, profound joy and jubilation. And once again, as on 29th November, I feel like the bereaved among the rejoicers.
Everybody was cheering in the streets. It was a big thing, dancing in the streets and all this. And he was standing in the back there. And he was asked, "This is a great day. This is your dream come true. 2,000 years we're in diaspora. You didn't like the diaspora. You want Hebrew, you want a state, you want this, you've got it." He says, "What the people are dancing here, what they don't know is tomorrow we've got a war." And he said there's going to be a big prize.
It wasn't long before Ben-Gurion was proven right. In the Declaration of Independence, he had offered the Arabs an equal place in the new state. But that night, his olive branch was answered by the roar of Egyptian warplanes. At 1 minute past midnight, they bombed the city of Tel Aviv. And at dawn, tanks from 5 Arab armies rolled into the new state of Israel. Jewish diplomat Abba Eban later recalled that Israel knew the taste of birth and the fear of death in the same moment. A year later, in 1949, all sides had grown weary of fighting. Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria signed armistice agreements with Israel. The Jewish state had survived the first of many challenges to her existence.
The story of modern Israel is essentially the story of the return to the ancestral homeland of exiles from persecution, insecurity, and fear, in quest of freedom human dignity, independence, and peace.
She used to tell us very often, I never realized what John Hancock meant until I signed Golda Meir, the Declaration of Independence. Me, little Golda Meir, signing Declaration of Independence.
2 days after Israel declared independence, Golda Meir was sent back to America to raise more funds for the new Israeli army. For this trip, she received the first Israeli passport ever issued. 1 month later, she became Israel's first ambassador to the Soviet Union. She later served as the Minister of Labor and as Foreign Minister. In the early 1960s, Meir was diagnosed with lymphoma and briefly retired. But after the sudden death of Prime Minister Levi Eshkol in 1969, she was chosen to replace him. Meir held the office until 1974, when she resigned amid controversy over Israel's handling of the Yom Kippur War. She died of lymphoma 4 years later, at the age of 80. Two days after independence, Chaim Weizmann was chosen to be the first president of the new state of Israel, a position he held until his death. In his first official act, he met with President Truman to ask for funds to build the new country. From that meeting, he secured an export-import loan of $100 million.
I take the first opportunity to express my heartfelt thanks to the President of the United States and to the government of this country for all they've done in making out of Israel a reality.
The Weizmann Institute, founded in 1934, became a world leader in scientific and medical research. In 1952, Weizmann died at the age of 77, leaving behind a legacy as Israel's first great diplomat.
Dr. Weizmann's first name was C-H-A-I-M. Now, I didn't know how to pronounce it, so I called him Cham. Called him that to his face, and he liked it. He was a wonderful man, one of the wisest people I think I ever met. We had a long, long conversation, and he explained the situation from his viewpoint, and I listened to him very carefully. And at the same time, I sent for Eddie Jacobson, and they both sat down and talked to me for a long, long time. When we were through, I said, all right, you two Jews have put it over on me, and I'm glad you have.
After talking with Weizmann, President Truman instructed the State Department to support the UN's plan for partition in Palestine, which they did reluctantly. Then on May 14, 1948, President Truman recognized the new state of Israel, just 11 minutes after the British mandate officially ended.
The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel.
10 days later, Chaim Weizmann visited the White House and gave the president a Torah scroll as a symbol of Israel's gratitude. Truman's response? Well, thanks, Cham. I've always wanted one of these. Regarding his support for Israel, Truman would later say, I am Cyrus.
When Harry Truman, in retirement, is honored for having recognized the state of Israel, the words that come out of his mouth are, I am Cyrus. He was the one who helped the Jews return to the homeland thousands of years later. And he was the one who helped the Jews rebuild the Third Jewish Commonwealth. And he was the one who history was fortunate enough to have in the right place in the right time. History was fortunate, the American people were fortunate, the Jewish people were fortunate. He was a true hero.
I bring to the American people the warm greetings of the people of Israel and our gratitude for the unfailing sympathy of America with our efforts for independence and regeneration.
David Ben-Gurion became the first Prime Minister of Israel and the first Minister of Defense, offices he held for 14 years. He was later named one of Time magazine's 100 most important people of the 20th century.
In our revival, we have been inspired by the message of our Bible and by the traditions of our ancient history, which elevate the dignity of man and the principle of justice, and which command us to love our neighbor.
When Ben-Gurion retired from political life, he moved to a kibbutz in the Negev desert, where he spent his final years writing a history of Israel. In November of 1973, Ben-Gurion suffered a cerebral hemorrhage that would take his life 2 weeks later. At the same time, his grandson Alon was a patient at a different hospital. He had fought as a paratrooper in the Yom Kippur War and was still recovering from serious injuries.
I knew about him, that he's in the hospital. He didn't know about me. When he asked, where's Alon? They said, he's in the field, he's fine. Someone bought me a small TV, I'll never forget it. We saw the funeral through the television, black and white. Some of the doctors came and they sat with me. The doctors said it's an end of an era.
Since its rebirth, Israel has survived wars, terror attacks, and political opposition to its very existence. At the time of independence in 1948, there were just 650,000 Jews living in Israel. Today, that number has grown to more than 6 million, and every year, thousands more from around the world are coming home.
What you just saw is an excerpt from the docudrama, The Hope. It's a wonderful story of the history of Israel, the miraculous provision of God for that nation. You can have it. It's your gift for $10, or a gift of $10, and you can order either the DVD or the Blu-ray if you'd like to get a copy of your own, because it's quite amazing to have. Call the number on your screen. It's 1-800-759-0700, or you can log on to cbn.com/Israel the Hope. And you can also join the conversation about the Hope on our Facebook page. We'd love to hear your comments about it. So get a copy. It's an amazing, amazing docudrama.
Queen Victoria asked her Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, Mr. Prime Minister, what evidence do you have for the existence of God? And he replied, the Jew, Your Majesty. And it really, if there was ever anything that shows that there is a God in heaven who has a plan for humanity, you watch the history of the Jewish people. So anyhow, this DVD you ought to have a copy, you ought to have extra copies, you ought to have copies for your church, your synagogue, your study group, or whatever, because it really is an amazing thing and very informative. Well, still ahead, we've got your email questions. Scott says, I have a daughter who does not believe in our Lord and Savior. How do you talk to a stubborn non-believer? Well, we'll bring that question on and some more after this.
Welcome back to Washington for this CBN News break. A federal appeals court has ruled that pharmacists have to provide abortion-inducing drugs even if it violates their religious beliefs. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld Washington State's controversial pharmacy regulations, ruling against 2 individual pharmacists and 1 family-owned pharmacy. They've been referring patients to 30 nearby pharmacies for those drugs. The state allows pharmacies to refer patients elsewhere for all economic or safety reasons, but makes it illegal to refer patients for matters of conscience. Well, churches in Senegal will now have access to fresh water thanks to the support of CBN partners. Teaming up with the Beersheba organization, CBN is providing 6 villages with a water tower, solar pump and panels, and a drip irrigation network. The project will benefit over 3,000 people who otherwise would have no access to fresh water, and it will provide churches with income and influence that will help them minister the gospel in their communities. Good news. You can find out more about what CBN is doing around the world by logging on to cbn.com/international. Pat and Terry will be back right after this.
To see this week's top on-demand videos, go to cbn.com.
Well, it's time to bring it on with your email questions. And Pat, this first one comes from Scott, who says, I have a daughter who does not believe in our Lord and Savior. My wife has tried talking to her. Her grandparents have tried talking to her, and my mother has tried talking to her. My daughter is always saying how she has nightmares all the time. I tell her I pray for her every night that one day she'll find Jesus. She's set in her ways and very stubborn. How do you talk to a stubborn non-believer?
Well, in that case, the Bible says you bring up a child in the way that he shall go, and when he's old, he won't depart therefrom. I don't know what you did with that kid when she was younger, but apparently you didn't bring her up, or maybe you did. And that, if you brought her up in the ways of the Lord, she'll come back to them. But in the meantime, all I can say is pray and set before her an example of Christian living, where she sees you and your wife, and she sees the way you deal with people, your honesty and integrity. And before long, she'll say, well, my daddy or my mother, I can see the way they lived, and I want to live that way too. That's the way to go. All right.
Okay, Pat, this is from Eugene, who says, excuse me, my wife and I are lifelong 700 Club members. We often hear how the Republicans are so against abortion and Democrats are so pro-choice. But this was not the case on the Roe v. Wade decision. 3 Nixon appointees, Blackmun, Powell, Berger, and 2 Eisenhower appointees, Brennan and Stewart, comprised a Republican majority, even without the 2 Democrats, Marshall and Douglas, voting. Why are these men not called out for the genocide against the unborn? Why did they all live to be such an old age after committing such a despicable act that has brought a curse upon the land? Please set the record straight.
Well, you'll have to ask God why he didn't kill them. I'm not in charge of the death or life of the Supreme Court judges. So it's in God's hands whether they live a long life. But that thing was called Blackmun's abortion, and Blackmun indeed was a Nixon appointee. You're absolutely right. It was an incredibly bad decision. It was based on no science, nothing that was there, but they picked up stuff from Planned Parenthood and other, population. The wealthy people of our country wanted to make sure that the black and the less fortunate didn't outbreed us. So they wanted to make sure the population of those people stayed small. I know that sounds gross, but that's what they believed. And then they had Margaret Sanger, who was saying that black people are inferior, that Southern white people are inferior, that European Protestants are inferior. I mean, she went all the way down the line. She wanted eugenics. And so they bought into that, but it was a horrible decision. And you're absolutely right. Being Republican or being Democrat does not mean the Supreme Court is going to go along with righteousness. And in that case, it certainly didn't. All right.
Okay, this is Tim, who says, Pat, I'm curious. I'm studying sports management. I want to represent NBA players. I am a Christian. Is it a sin to make a lot of money? I'm not about that, but if God blesses me with fortune, how can I honor him with money?
Well, what you can honor him is to give some of it away and to help the poor and the needy. But if you follow the principles of God, if you give and you love, it'll be given unto you, pressed down, good measure, running over. So if you do what God wants you to do, you will prosper. and not necessarily insanely wealthy, but you will prosper. That's what the Bible says. Okay?
This is an interesting one. This viewer says, I'm 72. I got saved in 2000. I recently was reminded of an incident 40 years ago in which I got drunk, drove a company car, and wrecked it into a parked car. Next morning, I reported the car stolen and wrecked, and they believed me. Only the Lord and I know this. After 40 years, do I need to try to make restitution?
If the company's still in business, and it may not well be, but if it is, you write the treasurer and tell him of your incident, and he doesn't want to deal with you, and he doesn't want to bring it up, but it's too. But at least it'll get it off your conscience. You know, in the government, the military, they've got a conscience fund. People who have stolen money or misused federal funds, and they get money sent to them, and they just put it in that fund, and that's the end of it. But I think for yourself, you could write the treasurer or whoever, find out who the official is, and say, I just want to tell you, 40 years ago, the statute of limitations is run, it's all over, they can't prosecute you. But you confess it and it'll get it off your heart. Well, we leave you with today's Power Minute from Psalm 122. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you. Well, on tomorrow's program, the series The Hope continues with a profile of the man who revived the Hebrew language. I met his son. It's a fascinating account. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.